So our first presenter is going to the title Marxist theorization and indigenous struggles. I welcome you, Mr. Debroy, for the presentation.
Am I audible?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Hello, everybody. This is Suddhabrata Debroy. I'm a research scholar in the University of Ontario in New Zealand. And my topic for the day is
Can you
dogmatic.
be a little sorry? Can you be a little louder? I think it would be
Okay,
better for us.
okay,
Yes.
okay. My topic for the day is dogmatic Marxist theorization and indigenous struggles arguing for revitalization. Now, the relationship between Marxist theory, I'll be making an oral presentation. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint slide for the same because it's mostly theoretical in nature, so it doesn't make a sense to make a lot of PowerPoint because it doesn't have any pictures or visual matter for that matter. Uh, yeah, so coming back to the paper, the relationship between Marxist theory and indigenous struggles have always been sort of an ambiguous one. And there are reasons for that everywhere because there is a very different conception of progress. There is a concept of historical materialism infested, which is within Marxism, and that becomes sort of a barrier between how to theorize indigenous struggles or indigenous communities, especially when it comes to modern day society, where indigenous communities are portrayed to be, even in the dominant media or even in non-mainstream media, to be somewhere of a romanticized sort of a feudal sort of setup. Now, I talk about two main concepts here, which are very important in understanding the relationship, which is the first concept is indigenous capitalism, and the second concept is that of progress. Progress, quote unquote, progress, because I deal with progress as a concept itself, which has very different amount of which has a very different connotation in itself as I'll demonstrate as I move forward. The first point which I make is what is dogmatic Marxism? Now, I primarily draw in my inspiration from what like Ben Habib and Cornell in their ideas regarding Orthodox Marxism talk about what is Orthodox Marxism itself. That's the portrayal of historical materialism as a science which cannot be, which moves in like an iron law as and all societies will inevitably fall into that category, which basically means that progress as we know it will happen regardless of what are the social dimensions. It's a very macro sort of perspective. The second thing is such a science of society which makes production relations determinant in the last instance in explaining social phenomenon, which explaining social transformation, which basically results more often than not into a sort of economistic ideas, as we have seen in the Soviet Union, for that matter, after post 1923, and also in China post 1978, when Deng came into power, where progress was meant to be a science, and everywhere it was said that, yeah, we have reached this stage, okay, the indigenous communities will be assimilated, this, that, etc., etc. The third point that Ben Habib and Colonel say is that the consciousness of a social group as well as its potential for revolutionary social transformation is determined by its position in the production process, which are social classes are defined in terms of such positions and are the most important collective actors in history, which is again a sort of classist perspective, which makes other factors like, for example, race, caste, gender very they place those concepts in a very ambiguous position within the general Marxist theory, which has been sort of the problem with most of the gender movements or caste movements or race movements, etc., etc. Now, to differentiate the term between orthodox and the term that I will use, which is dogmatic, I use a fourth point, which I have included, which was the attempt to universalize methods of revolt and revolutionary strategies, which is a form of argumentation which I draw from the French scholar Regis Debray and the Russian Bolshevik Leon Trotsky. Now, coming to the two concepts that I highlight in the paper, the first part of the paper deals with the concept of indigenous capitalism, which I portrays how indigenous communities are integrated into the global capitalist order, and how the world market, and how they are very much a part of the world market, no matter how we try to portray them as romanticized communities. Like, for example, what's happening with the Adivasis in India, and with the developmental programs which is happening. Like, when the developmental programs are passed, they are passed in a manner that this will make them progress. But what is the progress itself? What does progress mean for them? Like it's a very clear trajectory. Like, it's a lucky trajectory that my previous presenter talked about this. Like, are the animal sacrifices, NEP, new environmental paradigm, etc., and how these were part of indigenous struggles, and how this can be accommodated within the indigenous struggle framework. Now, the second part of the paper deals with the concept of progress. So coming to the first point, which is indigenous capitalism. Now, it's necessary itself to first of all argue in favor that why it's necessary to theorize about indigenous capitalism itself. Now, because in other now the primary reason for this is that in places like North America, in places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., everywhere, like even in India, indigenous communities have very much been part of our daily lives. Like, if we see places like Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand, or for example Bihar or West Bengal, everywhere, indigenous communities are a part and parcel of our daily lives, and they have their own business setups, and they have been within that setup. They are within a dominant global order, which, even if they want to, they can't alienate themselves from at this current moment. Like, in the case of India, we can take the what's happening in the tribal areas, like the land grab, etc., etc., everything else, the land grab, the land mafia which is operating there. These are all parts and parcels of the global order, because the money continuously flows. The cycle of capital is there, and they have to sort of channelize the profits that they gather to somewhere to bring in greater profits for themselves. And that happens in each and every step as we move higher up in the social order. Now, the proper theorization of indigenous capitalism will result, basically, for heterodox Marxist theory, it will result in two things. The first point is that we'd be able to see indigenous ways of life as sufficiently advanced ways of life, which demand, which do not demand destruction, but rather deconstruction, using a Derridian concept. And on the other hand, it will allow Marxist theory to conceptualize social class within indigenous communities, which is sort of a very, because when we talk about the Adivasi struggle, or when we talk about the racial struggle, there's very much a tendency within all of us, or even in terms of gender struggle, there's very much a tendency within all of us to put everything in the same box. Now, even within a tribal community, as many scholars have shown us, especially the Canadian scholar Scott Simon, from whom I draw huge inspiration, when he talks about how in a village in Laos, Laos is a country in South Asia, how in a village in Laos, women are the one who are beginning to emerge as the new petty bourgeois, or the new middle class in a society which is very much underprivileged in terms of development, and etc., etc., and how they use their traditional the traditional social capital that they have to go higher up in the order in terms of formulating their own business strategies, making doing startups, in entrepreneurial spirit within them, etc., etc., and how these are all placing themselves in a social hierarchy, which they place themselves in a higher social order, and through that they can influence the politics of the region itself, which again is connected to the broader politics of Laos. Laos is a country. Now, even I've very much I'm sorry, that was actually it's not Laos, it's actually the Truku Society of Taiwan. I made a confusion between a separate observation and that. Very sorry for that. Now, going forward, there is the problem of now situating it in classical theory. Now, we have, now, as I talked about, also for people who have read the abstract, I talked about the Peruvian Marxist Jose Carlos Maritagui, who was sort of the first indigenous, was sort of the first indigenous Marxist scholar who had a world reputation himself. And Maritagui was one of the first Marxists who was talking about the differences between formal capitalism and indigenous capitalism. Now, understanding indigenous capitalism through a Maritaguin concept will definitely lead Marxist theorization into a potentially better position from which it can argue in favor of diverse modes of struggle and create a basis upon which it can transgress the reductionist idea of social class being the all in all of social struggles. Now, as we have seen in Simon's study of the Truku societies of Taiwan, Marietagui also talked about how a particular section of the Indian community in Peru was gaining a huge sort of social power, as even with the advent of colonialism, because it was placed at a higher social hierarchy in there, and they could generate the enough resources to gather up the entire social capital and economic capital that they have in like they could enforce that power in generating more political consciousness in favor of themselves. Now, Maritagui analyzed the coexistence of the feudal economy along with, based on colonization and indigenous communal economy, along with the bourgeois economy in the entire in the Peruvian region. Now, this is something which is hugely important even in case of India, because unless and until we deconstruct the idea that there are separate societies, that for example, even in a space like Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, the tribal areas of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, the modes of societal organization in tribal areas are distinctly different from how we as mainstream, for example, this quote unquote mainstream society, think of ourselves as tribal area, think of ourselves as tribal, like as advanced societies. Coming now to the idea of progress. Now, it is undeniable that the idea of historical materialism related to the Marxist conceptualization of progress is extremely important for the study of indigenous movements, as a famed scholar Hokuitu stated while he was talking about Maori struggles in New Zealand. But it is equally important for the modern discourse to situate the theory within contemporary societies so as to equip the theory to analyze existing inequalities, because progress in tribal societies and progress for mainstream urban societies are different ideas in themselves. Like the advent of science, the advent of the modernity becomes a very important concept, because for example, if we look at the women's liberation struggle, dogmatic Marxist theorization inevitably puts the women's liberation struggle for something which is to be achieved in the future. That once the economic contradictions are over, once the economic contradictions are done for, then subsequently the gender contradictions will also be dealt with. But that does not always happen, which is sort of a reductionist understanding that once we deal with it economically, the problems of caste, the problems of gender will inevitably settle down, which hasn't actually materialized anywhere, be it the Soviet Union, be it China, or be it Cuba, where successful workers' revolutions have happened, but have inevitably become societies which are not very different in terms of other societal attributes.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you please conclude?
Yeah, I just need a
Okay,
single
sure.
minute. That's all. Uh, Now, the problem with all this is that what I try to do in the paper, because it's a very broad area that I'm dealing with, I try to situate these two ideas into the idea that was put forward by Stuart Hall, the cultural Marxist from the United Kingdom, into his ideas of contradictions, where he was saying that one contradiction cannot be reduced to another contradiction, and that was that if everything else, that Maria Tagui's our emphasis on different components of the dynamic totality, which took culture as a very important part of human society. Hall also argued that the only alternative to the different struggles of different sections of the populace was to build up multiple fronts depending on the contradiction which was dominating at that particular social setting. Now, that is what I argue in my paper, that there has to be further research into the various forms of pre-capitalist socio-economic formations which investigate into the contemporary and potential general applicability of these concepts, and in doing so allow historical materialist theory itself to get into a conversation with indigenous communities and their lives within the global capitalist order, which can go a long way forward in theorizing something which we might call indigenous Marxism, as we today have ecological Marxism and other varieties. That's all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sudhabrata. And is anyone there to put forward some questions? Or shall we? Yes, do we have questions? Please unmute and ask. I can't find. Is anyone trying to speak? Can we have the questions later then? So can we have the next speaker? Thank you very much. It was really insightful. We'll come to you, okay?
Thank you.
Yes. Reading poetic expressions from Adivasi communities in India by Suchitra Singh. Are you there? Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to extend my thankfulness for organizing and giving me a chance to present my paper. The topic of my presentation is reading poetic expressions from Adivasi communities in India. Indigenous communities, scheduled tribes, or Adivasis are the connotative terms designating the demographic communities living in secluded geographical regions beyond religion and caste system in India. They have been subjected to representative politics while being represented by non-Adivasis instead of Adivasis' own voices for a longer period of time. They have been relegated to an otherized position in literature, history, and politics. They have been glossed over as naive, innocent, savage, barbaric, Dasyus, and Datyas, positioning them in the idyllic imagination of innocence or as uncultured creatures in the lap of the nature. In relation to aboriginals, autochthones, and tribes, Adivasi is a term originating in the communities of Jharkhand and Central East states in India, situating themselves as the first settlers in the land way before the arrival of Dravidians or Indo-Aryan tales. Adivasi identity, worldview, and culture have survived through orality in opposition to written cultural archiving of mainstream society. Writing has been a tool of manipulation and omission used by the strengthened communities to eliminate the presence and participation of weaker communities in history and culture. PLSI records 860 languages in India, out of which 22 are scheduled languages. 480 languages are spoken by Adivasis and nomadic tribes, while 80 are coastal languages. Surprisingly, only 2 Adivasi languages, Bodo and Santhali, has found inclusion recently in the scheduled languages list. Independence movement has also proved to be a fatal failure for the Adivasis, as earlier they were oppressed under the British imperialists and landlord, while presently they are being oppressed by the industrial invasion, musclemen, and state apparatus. And more than that, historically, in the history or literature books, nobody except Birsa Munda finds a referential mentioning in literature or history. Post-independence, development to them meant landlessness, displacement from their forests, violences, and blunt assault on their cultural and social practices, which has rendered numerous sores in the memory, body, and landscape of the Adivasis, which has been carried over by the generations through their orality. Historical consciousness of being pushed to the periphery has created a group of Adivasi writers, poets, activists who are raising their voices through writing in their native languages, as well as also adopted the majoritarian languages. These writers and poets are registering their own branch of minor literatures around the concerns, demands, and experiences of Adivasi communities. Minor literature is a term derived by Deleuze and Guattari in reference to the Kafka's work, which has three constituent components: deterritorialization of language, connection of individual to a political immediacy, and collective utterance. Earlier presented, the poem by Vahru Sonwane who is among the first writers who deterritorialized the language to convey the dismay, pain, and sorrow of Adivasis in Marathi language while belonging to the Bhil community. Anush Lagoon is another remarkable poet belonging to Munda community. He writes in Hindi language and has won Yuva Sahitya Akademi Award for his poem Baag aur Sugna Munda Ki Beti. In this poem, he reasserts the Adivasi identity through a female poetic character and postulates Adivasi's worldview consisting of every human being exploited and oppressed by the privileged ones, and their vision of freedom and independence being the promise for better future and being the ground for popular Adivasi revolts. And as Ramnika Gupta says, that Adivasi writing is not just the expansion of their pride and identity, but it is the signifier of their advancing adaptive Adivasi voices. It is not just the joy and celebration, rather it is the process of becoming the vocal, fiery spirit of Ulgulan. These literary voices are just awaiting the time to become arrows, as pens have already become the arrows. In this poem of Mahadev Toko, he says that if the outsiders, Dikus, will conspire to drown the Adivasi community members in the bottle of mahua or by the false promises, they will not stay silent. They will pick up their bows along with the pen to save the forest and the greenery. To save the forest and its greenery is one of the root causes for emerging political immediacy, along with displacement and brutal onslaught of industrial destruction on the mountains, hills, rivers in the heartland of Adivasi populations. That is Jharkhand, as noted in the poem The Blossoms of Saranda by Jacinta Kerketa. In the last stanza, Kerketa asserts the unrelenting eros embedded in the lives and environment and nature of Adivasi consciousness, which drives them to look for hope, regeneration, and new beginnings in the face of repeated adversities. Adivasi women's position, their role, are one of the indispensable themes in the discussion of Adivasi poetic voices. Historically, it has been noted that Adivasi women have been pushed to this sexual objectification by the patriarchal male gaze of the privileged communities and writers. They have been simultaneously made weaker in their claim to physical labor, freedom of mobility, and dignity as exercised previously in their own community. Nirmala Putul, Anush Lagoon, Vandana Tete, and Mahashweta Devi have taken these issues and raised them into literary and social consciousness of everyday reading audiences. In this poem, Kuch Mat Kaho Sajoni Kisku, Nirmala Putul's poetic voices asks Sajoni Kisku to not perform her daily activities of farming, free discussion with the males of her communities. She cautions her not to inquire her land rights or civil liberties, as the community, due to its own ill practices, the gods and leaders of the communities can even sell them for the bottle of a mere alcohol. In another poem, Chudka Soren, Putul's poetic voice again strikes a monologue with the title character cautioning him against the threats of rapid modernization, industrial invasion, and arrival of contractors, social workers, employment agencies in the hinterland who befool the Adivasis to transact women, to send them to the cities for household jobs, but rather house helps. Rather, they are sold into prostitution, women in exchange of better income and prospects of prosperity. But the issue of Adivasi women is just not about the sexual and economical exploitation. Rather, it is also about the ideological exploitation of women by their fellow sex in the feminist movements in which they have been left out or just used as token to gain the momentum. In this poem of Poor Women on Stage, Anush Lagoon voices the ground realities of Adivasi collectives against the capitalist oppression and violences. He applauds the liveliness, intelligence, vigor, and jubilant laughter of these small Adivasi women collectives and their endeavors. There is a spectrum of difference in the understanding, perspective, and problems of the feminist voices floating in the elite seminars, political movements, which are far away from the real problems or issues faced by the women collectives. These differences and the mediations are attempted to be conveyed in another poem by Nirmala Putul in her poem "वह जो अक्सर तुम्हारी पकड़ से छूट जाता है." A woman is crying in the mountains and another one is smiling while peeping out from the third floor windows of her mansion. Hey, you, the one reciting poems about the women. Can you see the events taking place in the spaces left between these two women? Note, these events taking place somewhere in some time spaces. This is what has never been in your reach. A woman is singing, another one is crying, and in between them, a third one is standing. Looking time and again while pondering, hey, you, the poets in the feminist discussions, can you tell what is it that the third woman is thinking? The question of this third woman thoughts or that of the events unsaid and unacknowledged between the women crying in the mountain and one peeping out of the window is of discussion for Adivasi activists, poets, and writers who have been trying to voice their issues of common bread earners and underprivileged Adivasis to the forefront. By reading these poems and poetic expressions, one can understand that Adivasi poetic expressions are commonly voicing their need to be acknowledged as an individual body of discussion, to gain freedom from anonymity and acknowledgement, to move ahead from the subjugation and oppression under the model of development forced upon them. All these schisms in the representation of Adivasi in the various milieus has resulted into a great sense of collective utterance of Adivasidom, which brings every facet of life and their world, whether it is of environment degradation, land alienation, capitalist exploitations, women's rights, or representations to the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suchitra. It was wonderful. Moving on to the next speaker, we will have Dimpy Sonowal. Are you here, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I invite you to present your paper on Sonowal. Am I audible? Or is it some echo?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so please begin your paper.
Is this visible, ma'am?
Yes. Yes, yes.
A very good afternoon, ma'am, and all participants. And my presentation's topic is role of Kiring Baito Puja and hiding the songs for identity construction of the Sunwal Kasari tribe of Assam. Baito Puja has been celebrated since long times in the Sunwal Kasari's culture. This puja is celebrated to mark the beginning of a new year by the Sunwal Kasaris. Earlier, this puja was held inside the forest under a Gandharva tree. They used to keep the instrument of this ritual right under the Zamuk tree or blackberry. Later, it was shifted to the temple from the forest under the advice of the Guru of the Sunwal Kasaris, Gazai Guru Buramudui Danguria. So my paper aim is the importance and the significance of rule of Kiring Baito Puja and hiding the songs for identity construction of the Sunwal Kasari tribe of Assam. And I use two methods for collected my data. That one is observation method and another is interview method. And this is the geographical area of my research. That is Tinsukia district of Assam. The Sinual Kasari are indigenous ethnic community residing in the Assam. They belong to the Tibeto-Burman linguistic family, but they lost their own language due to the disintegration of their kingdom Halali, and they distributed a small part in the Brahmaputra Valley, so they are unable to apprehend their own language. They are predominantly inhabitants of the Dibrugarh, Dhemaji, Lakhimpur and Tinsukia. They are situated in the district of Sibsagar, Jorhat, Golaghat and Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh in northeast India also. They have a dual religious system. Traditionally they are Vaishnavism, but in the 17th century the emergence of the new Vaishnavism has influenced them. So at present, Baito Puja is celebrated at the central Baito temple, Tinsukia district of Assam. This is the central Baito temple, and it is a 3 days continuous process. This Nuwal Kasari worship Lord Shiva as a King Raja in this ritual. He is represented by a Gandhara tree. This temple is constructed by 21 pillars and the 3 roofs. Among the 21 pillars, 7 pillars denote the 7 clan of the community, and another 14 pillars denote the 14 sub-clan of the community, and 3 roofs of the temple signifying King Raja, Gajai and Manai. The main pillar of the temple, this is the main pillar of the temples, is made by the Gandhara tree. The Sunubal Kasari call is gambus. This pillars goes out of the roof and it's shaped like a spandex of a banana plant, which is the symbol of breedings. At the bottom of the pillar is associated with the 2 4-faced earthen lamps. Both the light represented to symbolize unity of the Purus and Prakriti. Among the 2 earthen lamps, one lamp is lighted for the welfare of the 4 creators such as Uran, those who can fly, Buron, those who live in water, Gajan, tree or Sase, as those who grow, and Brahman, the human beings, while the other light is dedicated to the King Raja, Gajai, Manai and Fulkur. Sunwal as in the main pillar as a Siblingam. The main pillar is surrounded by a wall with 9 corners and 1 door through which light savings birds comes and goes out. At the 9th corners, the 9 earthen lamps are lightings during the puja. Puja times, and these 9 lights are dedicated to the 9th sister of the Lakshmi Devi. This puja is practiced on the second Monday in the Assam or so Sibrati, but a ritual is held on the previous evening, that is on Sunday evening, which is associated with 2 rituals. One is called Danumua. Through this ritual, they worship the grain sacrifice sword, and another is called Deonumua. Through this ritual, they evocation of their god goddesses and bring down the musical instrument for their performance. So, main ritual is started from the Monday, which associated with 2 rituals. First ritual is the first ritual they celebrated the worship at the Baito temples, and here the Purus Puja is held at the Baito temples, and Raja Guru, the chief priest of the Baito temple, started the ritual from midnight of the Monday to the till mornings, and the Prakriti Puja is held of the Bhuruli Hall. The Bhuruli Hall is situated separately near the temples. Bhuruli means Parvati. Saikya, the chief priest of the Bhuruli Hall, started the ritual, and associated priests also helped him. Here, 33 crores god goddesses are placed for worships. After complete the Vaito temples and Bhuruli Hall worships, grain sacrifice is carried on a pair of pigs by the Saikya at the Bhuruli Hall. So for the noon of the Tuesday, they perform 4 kinds of ritualistic dance and songs. They are Haidang Day songs. These songs are considered to be the first and oldest songs of the Sunwal Kasaris band. Log Bihu. Through the Logs Bihu, they evoke the mythological goddess of the nature, that is Bordoisila, and spread the news among the community that New Year is coming. And then Dhankuti they give. Through this Dhankuti they give their ceremonially welcome of the rice seedings goddess Lakshmi Devi to the earth. Then Husori. The Husori of the Sunubal Kasari consists of prayer to Shiva and Parvati and other god goddesses and impact basic knowledge about human's body and mind. And then with the third ritual is called Bhagdev Puja, or the worship of tiger. With this ritual, Baito Puja is end on the Wednesday, and in this ritual is the This ritual is celebrated in the under forest. So I come to the Haidang Day songs. Uh, it said that harm in soils or dungs means creations. Uh, so it has 11 chapter. In the first chapter of the Haidang Day songs, the philosophy and religious behavior with the creation of various components of the universe structure and described. In the second chapter, the story of creation of the universe is defined symbolically through the narration of the birth of the birds. In the third chapter, comparative details on the conscious and unconscious life and lifeless are being started. It also expresses the deep realization about suffering in their lives of primitive peoples and about the magnitude and glory of animals and other universal objects. In the fourth chapter, it is try to reveal as to how the people of primitive states and have developed and from their society and how imagination from nature taught them to and get married and also maintain about the 14 clan of the Sunwal Kasaris. In the fifth chapter, it songs how Kiring Raja, the chief deity of the Sunwal Kasari, into the residence of the Kiring Sankhas for performing the marriage and how the two daughters of the King Sankha named Lurupi and Surupi delighted to the appearance of the Kiring Raja and hence agreed to marry. In an attractive description is said about Kiring Raja with the daughter of the King Sankha. In the sum of restriction, they broke out at a battle in the marriage venue. In this battle, the heavenly power took the side of the Kiring Raja, and as Kiring Raja comes out victorious in this war. In chapter 8, describe about warm welcome of newly married brides to their husband, whom by the first wife of the Kiring Raja. In the ninth chapter, it is clearly explained that the main deity of the Sunumal Kasari is Lord Shiva, which is known as Kiring Raja. In the 10th chapter of the songs, mother goddesses of the agriculture, Lakshmi is collected from the river and Jamukti or blackberry of the main house of the Raja. Examples. In concluding part of the Haidang Day songs, Kiring Raja is brings prayer to forgive them for mistaken committed by them while preparing for the welfare of the four classes of the living beings comprising Ron, those who can fly, on those who live in water, Gajan, Theo, such as those who grow, Brahman, the human beings. And conclusion part. Baito worship of the Sunumal Kasari is a primitive magico-religious observations characterized by ritual purity, sacrifice, nature worship, and on emphasis on fertility. Through the Baito worship, Sunumal Kasari derives solidarity and identity among themselves by the participants and celebrating to the Kiring Baito Puja, which has contributed their unique ethnic identity within the society. It is observed that Haidang Day song of Sunumal Kasari tribe is one of the oldest and the unique ritualistic folk performance, and it is observed that Haidang Day songs has been an integral part of their folk life, which has contributed in building up their unique identity. Therefore, we can conclude that the rule of the Baito Puja and the Kiring and the Haidang Day songs has great importance and significance for their identity construction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dempi Sonowal. It was really a new field of study for us, at least me. And it was wonderful to listen to you. Coming to our fourth presenter, she will be speaking on sketching the identity, a reading of select Dalit autobiographical extracts. I would like to welcome Namrata Manmohan, please. Is she here?
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Okay, Neeta.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, you want to speak? Sorry, then let's swap it. So, Neeta Prasad will be speaking on revisiting the Yakshi myth in Kerala, right?
Yes,
So,
ma'am.
I welcome you. Yes, please. You're audible.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, everybody. My paper titled Revisiting the Yakshi Myth of Kerala is an attempt to revisit the myth of Yakshi, which forms part and parcel of the cultural fabric of Kerala, a state belonging to southern India. From a wider perspective, Yakshi is a female goddess associated with the fertility of earth, of love and beauty. And the Yakshi cult has evolved through the times, and the myth of Yakshi as the monstrous feminine has parallels in many cultures around the world. In the laws and legends from many parts of the pre-modern Kerala society, Ekshi is sort of a female vampire whose abode is a particular tree. She is extremely beautiful, has knee-length hair, and she charms young men who happen to come across her at night. She lures them to her abode, and when the sun rises, only nails and bones of the young men remain under the tree. Yes, she is a nightmare for the male travelers who traverse the night. There are two ways one can tame a Ekshi, either by driving an iron rod into the head or by nailing her spirit onto the pala tree. And in all these legends, it was the male priest, mostly the upper caste male priest, who tames the Ekshi. To analyze the myth of Ekshi, we need to place it within the socio-political and cultural milieu of Kerala society of the pre-modern times. The end of matrilini marked the beginning of female domesticity in Kerala. At the top of the hierarchical structure were the upper caste men, the feudal lords who enjoyed all the benefits patriarchy could confer. The women of the lower caste had to face double marginalization and suppression in that caste-based hierarchical structure. Atrocities against women took the form of rape and murder subsequently. Thus, revisiting the myth of Ekshi becomes a political act. It becomes a probe into unequal power relations, issues related to gender, class, suppression, and resistance. From the vantage point of power, Ekshi is the object, an idea borrowed from Julia Kristeva. She is a female who, unlike other females of flesh and blood of her times, disrupts the patriarchal order. Ekshi disturbs social reason or the communal consensus that underpins a particular social order. Ekshi thus becomes a threat. She symbolizes the immense potential of female sexuality which cannot be tamed by patriarchy. As I mentioned before, Ekshis are mostly spirits of women who were abused and murdered, who after death seek revenge on upper caste feudal landlords. Hence, there is an element of class struggle, of revolution and resistance. Yet, in all the laws and legends, the Ekshi gets tamed. Ekshi gets tamed down by men in the end, and that's how the stories go. But the anxiety or the fear persists in the collective imagination or collective psyche of the people. With the advent of colonial modernity and the progress the society had made in terms of education and scientific timber, the fear of supernatural spirits had taken a backseat. Yet the myth found expression in art, literature, and films as well in myriad ways. To sum up, an exploration into the myth of Ekshi throws light on sides of struggle and resistance and opens up spaces for constructive or deconstructive discussions on caste, class, gender, and it tears down the facade of complacency every society wears. To quote Joseph Campbell, myth is not about what happened in past times. Myth is about what happened to people all of the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neeta. And do we have the last speaker with us? Namrata Manmohan? Are you there, please? Okay, so since we do not find her, there was a question. Please put forward your questions. So there was one question for Suchitra from Roshan. Roshan, are you there? Would you like to read it? So it's how can we preserve Adivasi languages or the language or the folk poems? Suchitra, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, sure. We can preserve Adivasi languages and folk poems by providing an education system or platform for the usage of the Adivasis language, to provide them an environment wherein they can feel safeguard for their culture, where they can practice it. Like Adivasi children are getting educated a lot these days by, for example, Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences. It's a factory model school which has been blamed that, okay, these are educating the Adivasis children, but they are not let to go back to their culture or geographical locations, where in order of that they feel alienated and they get an inferiority complex for their own culture and for practice of their own languages, which is one of the reasons that even though they get educated and get part of the mainstream culture and society, they leave their own language and culture by coercion, by a cultural coercion by the mainstream society's model of education and development. And another thing, that in to preserve the Adivasi orality or poetic expressions, there has to be made their inclusion in the classroom, in the graduation or post-graduation classes, wherein, for example, we have been taught about the Chinua Achebe and African tribal situation and their representation. But even I have majored in English and done my post graduation also in English. I did not know about the tribal stories or their representation till the time I started venturing on displacement problems of Adivasi communities. So yeah, a need of translation for both the way, for bringing the mainstream society's expression or stories into the Adivasis languages, as well as the Adivasis expressions to be translated into the mainstream languages by current day scholars, is indeed needed. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Suchitra. Thank you for answering it so well. Just one thing I would like to extend. Do you think, this is again for Suchitra, do you think the poets that you have talked about, are they able to create an empathy and understanding for Adivasis in the broad spectrum in the society? Do you think it is working?
Yes, I think it has been working because of this lockdown situation and so upcoming of so many web platforms. There have been new platforms like Sakwa. Sakwa is a newly emerging women's poetic collective or women's collective, which discusses around the issues of Adivasi culture, like their political lack of representation. That even though there is a lot of literature already present, but they are not being conveyed. They do not talk to the greater mass, like the students or the people living in mega cities. They really don't know about the indigenous people and their presence and participation, the everyday participation of them. And Roshan Murve has asked that many are not educated. So that not getting educated is a problem of the state. The state has been neglectful towards the Adivasi communities. The development means freedom from the problem of hunger, shelter, and education. It is meant to provide a wider spectrum of these facilities. But not getting educated is more of a problem of policies and infrastructure, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Suchitra. Anyone else who have some questions? All of you were listening so diligently, making notes. And do we have Namrita here? Namrita, yes? Has she come?
No, ma'am.
She's not here. So no more questions? Can we then wind up?
Yes, ma'am.
So it was really wonderful attending this session and being the chairperson for this, the theme being the marginalized, the indigenous community. And I was really interested in the way how the national, the regional, and the global, all of it was there in this session, and how you brought them together. And there could have been many more analytical questions on this as well. And identity issues were being discussed, the myths of Kerala, and through that we came to basically address issues of gender and caste and patriarchy, such kind of things. So it was really a wonderful session, and we are just running short of time, so I will not take more time. And thank you very much, each one of you. Thank you to the Cape Comorin and Shubhra for this wonderful session. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.